Okay, can you
Yes,
can you see my screen?
yes, we can.
Okay. Well, this is a very exciting opportunity. I'm very glad to be here. Many of you I know and recognize from the EVS for many years, but it has been probably 7 or 8 years now since I've been to Europe. But it's wonderful that now with everybody online, I can come to Europe in the middle of the afternoon here in Boston. I've took my notes and translated them using Google Translate so that hopefully the French is easier for you than the English, and I'll try to keep up with the text as we move along here. Turn with me to Romans chapter 12. Of course, I'm going to be reading in English. But in Romans chapter 12, after 11 chapters of arguing about different points of theology, Paul starts to get practical. And he says, therefore, I urge you, brothers, in God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. And here in Boston, we have a class where we're teaching and we're working through the Richard Foster's book on the celebration of discipline, which I understand you have now in French. And we've been studying this out, trying to understand how we can be transformed more, how we can change our mind. And the word transformation, metamorpho, really means to change your shape or to change your form, who you are. And this is not an easy thing to do. It's challenging, and we're finding that as we get into it, each one of us is challenged in different ways. The dilemma is that bad habits are hard to change. By bad habits, I mean things that are not good spiritual habits. And in addition, good habits are hard to implement in our lives in a healthy way. To form new habits, we have to force ourselves to be different. We have to change our mind about how we live and how we're doing things. We have to often change our schedule. If you're going to put time into meditation or more reading of the Bible or more prayer time, then something else is going to have to change. And it takes a while to make a new habit. So in the process of making this habit, we can often feel like I'm just doing this very legalistically. I am just doing it. I don't feel it. It's not changing me. It's taking a lot of my time. I should be doing other things. And I can feel very legalistic is the good word. In addition, if we begin to change, we can sometimes become very prideful about that change. I know for myself that as I change, I often look at other people and wonder, why aren't you changing also? This is so amazing. Why can't you do this? And we begin to make judgments, and we begin to, things about our lives change. And this is very human. It's a very natural thing that happens when we are living by our own strength rather than living by the grace of God. And so tonight, I thought I would talk a little bit about how to deal with and how to identify this in ourselves so that we don't lose heart, right? So the goal of the spiritual disciplines is for me to draw close to God. It's for me to make changes in my life and to be closer to God as a result of it. And the disciplines that we're talking about are things that people have practiced for 2,000 years or more. And So they're proven, they work. And it's easy to lose sight of what the goal is. The goal is to be close to God. But as we're trying to learn new habits, sometimes the process of changing takes more of our effort than actually being close to God. And this is also a very common thing. It can be very frustrating. And sometimes as we're trying to get close to God, we miss the target. We lose sight of what we're trying to change. Now, this is not a new problem. Look in Luke chapter 18. These are stories I'm sure that you're all familiar with. I'm not going to be reading any new scriptures tonight, really. It's simply taking the scriptures that we know and maybe learning a little bit more out of them. But in Luke chapter 18, starting in verse 9, we find this parable, this story about the Pharisee and the tax collector, and we're all familiar with it. It says, to some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everybody else, Jesus told this parable. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood up and prayed about himself. God, I thank you that I'm not like that other men, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week, and I give 1/10 of all that I get. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but he beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. You know, and I believe that the context of this passage is that Jesus had just talked to them. He's talking about prayer. The context is prayer and the persistent praying of the widow who went before the judge and kept bothering until he listened. And yet, Jesus was well aware that it's very easy for people, particularly the Pharisees are good examples. They're spiritual men. The Pharisees were very serious about their lives. Many of them would be more religious than we are in many ways, and rightly so. He prayed, he fasted, he gave his tithe. And what's interesting is Jesus did not say, you're just making this all up. You aren't doing those things. You're a total hypocrite. He basically said, he said, the problem is that you're doing all this for other people to see, and you're very prideful and legalistic about it. This man believed that because he did this thing, he was better than those around him who were not doing it. And if you're seriously going to change your life, you will struggle with the same challenge. And the question becomes, how do I change without becoming legalistic? How do I discipline myself to change without sinning or missing the goal or the mark? The goal is not discipline for discipline's sake, but the goal, remember, is to draw closer to God. Now, I want to take a moment to divert here and just talk about righteousness. In Matthew chapter 5, which is, of course, the Sermon on the Mount, in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is talking about the Pharisees and the law, and he basically makes this very simple statement in verse 20. He says, for I tell you, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, this is a big challenge because the Pharisees were very serious about their righteousness. The problem is their righteousness, they were doing the right things, but they were doing them for the wrong motives. Almost everything that the Pharisees did, they could point to the law and say, we are being obedient to the law. And they were right, but they were so righteous, not right about being that way, that they were not actually in tune with the people around them. Now, I've done studies before, and some of you have probably heard them, but righteousness is a concept in the Bible, has to do with the quality of the relationship. And so when we're striving to be righteous, there's always another person involved that we're directing our effort towards. And I'm going to address this a little bit more later. But we have to remember righteousness. The problem is that the Pharisees were self-righteous. They were not measuring their righteousness about how it affected other people. They measured their righteousness simply by how obedient they were being to the law of the Old Testament. And they were doing this so that other people would see them. And the implication was they were not trying to draw close to God. They were simply trying to show that they were more righteous, more religious. Now, it's important to distinguish between legalism and personal discipline. This is because if you're going to pray every day and you have a Pharisee who's praying every day, your lives may look very similar. One is legalistic, but one is personal discipline. And the important thing to remember is you can have exactly the same activity. So externally, you can look exactly the same as another person. But whether the heart with which you do it is whether it's legalistic or whether it's righteous related to the relationships. So for instance, you can give, you can pray, you can fast, you can do your evangelism, all your hospitality, contact with other disciples, really strong relationships. But if you're doing that all for other people to see how you're doing it, then you're not really being righteous. You're being just legalistic. And I need to be careful about with myself in these ways, because the line is very fine, because it all has to do with my heart. And so tonight's topic, let me just switch the slide here. Tonight's topic is how to fight against legalism and sin in our pursuit of spiritual transformation. Turn with me to Matthew chapter 22. Now in verse 34, we find Jesus in a discussion with the Pharisees, as often the Sadducees, as often happens. It says in verse 34, hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. One of them, an expert in the law, tested him with this question: Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. The second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. All of the law and the prophets hang on these two commands. Now, we see that the Pharisee was testing Jesus, and I think the implication was that the Pharisee was very confident about his own righteousness, just like the man praying outside the temple. And so he wanted to see if Jesus understood, if Jesus knew what he was talking about, because the Pharisees did not really respect Jesus's teaching. And he wanted to see if Jesus would measure up. And Jesus comes back with a very simple thing. He says, look, it's very clear. First command is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. In the book of Luke, he adds the word strength. Then you have to love your neighbor in the same way as you love yourself. Now, the next statement is very important. He says, all of the law and the prophets rest on these two commands. What that means, I believe, is that all the other laws should be interpreted. All the other rules that that we might live by as disciples have to fall under the umbrella of these two commands. If what we're doing is not supported by love, then it's very likely that it's just going to be legalistic. So we see that the goal of our relationship, the goal of our spiritual transformation, is to love God more and to love others more. And so tonight I have 6 warnings and 4 challenges. I think they're fairly simple. They're not hard to understand. But I think it's very important that we pursue these, and we keep an eye on ourselves. In other words, we have to keep looking. The warning is, am I doing this? Am I falling into this pattern? If I find myself not loving God and not loving other people, then I'm missing this goal. It's sinful. It's not going in the right direction. In Galatians chapter 5, we find the list of sins that we like to show other people when we're studying the Bible with them. It's the most aggressive sin list in the Bible. But of course, it's followed. The real thing that Paul is pointing out is the contrast between living in a worldly way and living in a spiritual way, living by the Spirit of God. And he says in verse 22, but the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such things there is no law. I think it's very interesting that if you look at the list of sins, you can find in our society there are laws against almost every sin that we can name. But the fruit of the Spirit, there's nobody who says, you're just too loving, we're going to put you in jail because you're just too happy all the time. Or you're at peace, or I can't stand how patient you are. And these things are fruits of the Spirit, and we cannot confuse self-control, for instance, with legalism, the personal discipline with legalism. And what this is saying, basically, the first thing is love. And he says, if the form of what you're doing, if the way that you're practicing your righteousness is not loving, it does not exhibit or transform you to love God and others more, then you should take note and realize that you're probably missing the goal. Paul says we need to rejoice always. The spiritual discipline should produce joy. We should rejoice. We should find a way that when we pray more or when we meditate, that it builds us up in our joy and our walk before God. If you find that you're not at peace, we had a session Sunday morning. Our class this week was on meditation. And a number of people who were trying this for the first time expressed the fact that they could not be at peace. There were too many things going on in their lives, going on in the world around them, that they were not able to find peace. And this should not alarm us. I think the world wants to take away our peace, but we need to carefully note that when we can't do that, we need to change maybe the way we're doing things. We need to find how to find peace. If you find yourself not patient with yourself, or you're not patient with other people, you're off target and you're missing the goal. It's a warning. These are warning signs. It doesn't mean you've failed. It means that it's kind of like when you're driving down the highway. I don't know in Europe, but in the United States, we have these strips on the highway called rumble strips, and where they cut up the pavement a little bit, so that if you start to go off the road, it goes, the car just shakes, and it warns you when you're getting off the road. And these warnings are like rumble strips on the highway toward our goal. A second warning we should have is that if I find myself doing spiritual disciplines so that other people can see them, I'm missing the goal, and I'm probably being legalistic. In Matthew chapter 6, I think this is a good example. In Matthew chapter 6, again, going back to the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus begins talking, and he's talking about prayer, giving to the needy, and praying and fasting. And he says, be careful not to do your acts of righteousness before men to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. In verse 5, he says, when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites. They love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by men. I tell you the truth, they have received their reward in full. And he says something very similar about fasting. Now, it's important. Jesus is saying this in the context of the argument about righteousness and being more righteous than the Pharisees. I don't believe that Jesus is saying that if other people find out we're doing these things, that we've done something wrong. He's not saying that that people won't know or shouldn't know that you're doing these things. What he is saying is that if the purpose in doing them is so that other people will be impressed by you, then you have your reward already. People are impressed, and that's all the reward you'll get. However, if you strive to do the spiritual disciplines in such a way that your life is changed and people see your life changed, not that they see you doing these things in particular. And so if we do these things just for show, if we wake up one day and realize that, wow, it made me feel really good when this brother said, you're awesome, I see you meditating, how do you do that? That's amazing. Rather than I see you changing and becoming more like God, which is the goal. We should, again, the rumble strip on the highway, it's warning us, be careful how you're living your life. Warning number 3. In Luke chapter 18 again, we read the first half of this parable earlier. So I want to finish it here. The Pharisee, of course, he prayed, God, I thank you, I'm not like the other men, the robbers, the evildoers, adulterers, or even this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give a tenth of all I get. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He did not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. I tell you, this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled. He who humbles himself will be exalted. Now, the Pharisee, looking at the other man, could not see. He was not able to understand that the other man's efforts to pray was more acceptable to God. It didn't make sense to him, because to him, there were rules about prayer. You had to pray this way, and you had to tithe, and you had to fast, and you had to do things a certain way. And the other man just stood before God and said, I give up. I'm a sinner, and I don't know what to do. I'm calling to you to see what you want me to do. The Pharisee had a way of doing things that he thought was better, and he looked down on others. When Jesus said, look, I'll tell you the truth, this man went home justified before God, what he's saying is that if we wake up one day and we discover that there are other people, for instance, in the church, or maybe in your class, or in your family group, or whatever group that you have, and you've started to make progress, you've discovered something about prayer which really makes it joyful and fulfilling to you. And then you hear somebody else pray and you go, oh, he shouldn't be praying like that. He doesn't know what he's doing. He doesn't know what I know about prayer. Warning number 3, if you start to see this in your life, the rumble strip, you need to correct it and get back on the road in the right place. Okay. Warning number 4. If I find myself prideful for what I'm doing, I'm missing the goal. I'm missing the mark. I'm sinning. You know, I wish I had 10 disciples around me who fasted twice a week, who truly gave 10% of everything they had to the work of the kingdom. Not just 10% of their income, but their time, their money, their energy. What would happen if every one of us spent 10% of our wake time every day praying? Okay, I'm awake for approximately 18 hours. So that would be an hour and a half every day praying, 10% of my time. I think that would change the world. But it has to be for the right reason. If I do those things, if I sit down with my pencil and I mark in an hour and a half of prayer and I get my budget and I make sure that I give 10% and I add up everything in my house and what it's worth and I give 10% of that, and I do this very legalistically, then it will have no effect, right? Because this man, this Pharisee, was doing all these things that he was told to do, but he was not righteous like the man that he was condemning before God. When the man who beat his breast and called out to God may not have been doing any of these things. So again, we want to watch the rumble strip of pride, because it will tell us that we have to get back on the highway. I think it's important when the rules of men become more important than obeying God. I'm becoming legalistic and missing the goal. Look in Mark chapter 7. Again, a very familiar passage, I'm sure. But maybe in view of our desire to be growing, this is important. In verse 5, the Sadducees and the teachers of the law asked Jesus, right? Again, the same thing. He's talking with them, and they come after Jesus. Why don't your disciples live according to the tradition of the elders instead of eating their food with unclean hands? So the Jews had a lot of rituals where they would wash their hands many times, and particularly before they ate anything. And Jesus answers this way, verse 6. Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you, you hypocrites. As it is written, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are just rules taught by men. You have let go of the commands of God and are holding on to the traditions of men. And he said to them, you have a fine way of setting aside the commands of God in order to observe your own traditions. And then he talks about this situation where the Jews had, they wanted, money was supposed to be given to the temple. And if you gave money to the temple, that was part of your obligation of sort of generosity. And they had made up this rule in order to encourage giving money being given to the temple, that if you give money to the temple, you don't have to worry if you don't have enough money to take care of your parents, because it's important to give money to the temple. And we know that God was very concerned about honoring your father and mother. This is the very first commandment with a promise. And but the Jews were getting around their obligation to do what God really wanted them to do, because of this rule that they could give the money to the temple instead. And at the end of this passage, right there in verse 13, he says, "You nullify the word of God by your tradition that you have handed down, and you do many things like that." You know, I think Jesus doesn't list them, and I think that may be purposeful, in that this is a warning. We have to look at our own lives. We have to examine our own lives and look at things that we're doing that we hold to be very important. And maybe somebody else is not doing them, and we look down on them. And in fact, the things that we hold very important to us are not really scriptural. The parable of the Good Samaritan is, I think, a good example. A man is beaten up and he's down on the side of the road in Luke chapter 10. And the first two people that go by are a priest and a Levite. Now, these men may have had very important things to do. They may have had an appointment at the temple that they were late for, or maybe they were afraid of being unclean if they touched this man, and then they couldn't worship in the temple. And they had rules that they were living by that caused them to miss the goal of being a good neighbor. You know, if we give lots and lots of money to the church, but we don't have enough money to take care of our family, or there are many other things. And I think this is where each of us needs to look at our lives and say, are there things that I hold sacred that possibly get in the way of my relationship with God, that they aren't really biblical? And I think we need to be careful about this, because it's easy to use that as an excuse not to do things that we think are right. But I think we need to evaluate this, because it's, again, another warning sign. It's basically saying, if you find yourself not wanting to, rules that we've made up are getting in the way of becoming more like God, we need to be careful and watch out for them in our lives. Okay, warning number 6. If I begin to think that my way of practicing the disciplines is the only way, I am legalistic. I think there are many times where we have success at what we're doing. I know for myself, I spent a number of years trying to learn how for me to learn how to pray. And I learned many things, but it's also very easy and very tempting for me to tell other people, if you do it my way, it will work, and you need to do it my way. For instance, I get up early in the morning. I pray early in the morning. I go out for a walk, because that gets me away from the house where I'm distracted by things. I pray out loud. I find it's very difficult for me to pray in the car, because I'm having to pay attention to traffic, and I can't just let my mind go and be with God. And so there's a tendency for me to say to someone who doesn't get up early, who prays for 10 minutes, or maybe they pray at lunchtime or something, that there's something wrong with that, because I can't do it that way. I think Paul was very, very clear. You can look up Colossians chapter 2, but he basically says, do not let anyone judge you for their eating, for your drinking, for your religious festivals, your new moon celebration, or your Sabbath day. Because these things, you've figured out how to do them for you, but they're only a shadow. They're only a shadow of what is to come. The reality is your life connecting to Christ. So for instance, in our pursuit of the disciplines, we may try many different things. Maybe I like to meditate by sitting on a chair, facing a window, looking out over the reservoir behind my house. Other people will practice down in their basement or maybe in the closet. Some people will sit on the floor on a pillow. Some people have different ways of meditating, prayer. Some people will fast for 3 days at a time. Another person may fast 2 times a week, but only until 3 in the afternoon. That's the way a lot of the early Christians did it. But Paul says, don't judge each other based on these things, because these are just a shadow. The goal here is, are you coming into the reality of a life in Christ? And if you find yourself looking at other people and saying that's not going to work for them, they just have to do it my way, you're falling in this category. In Romans chapter 14, I want to read this. This is a very important passage. Paul is talking here about accepting one another in the fellowship. And he says in verse 5, one man considers one day more sacred than another. Another man considers every day alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. He who regards one day as special does so to the Lord. He eats meat, he eats to the Lord, for he gives thanks to God, and he who abstains does so to the Lord and gives thanks to God. What Paul is saying, I know for myself, I have many friends where Christmas is a very big deal. Personally, Christmas could be just like any other day to me. And I have a hard time understanding why it's such a big deal to some people. Some people make a big deal about their birthday. It's very important to them to celebrate their birthday. To me, I'm very much like Paul says, someone like every day is sort of the same. And for me to look down on others for the way that they have come to pray, or the way that they have learned, or like fasting or other disciplines in their lives, if I look down on them because they don't practice it my way, then I have become legalistic, and I should be very careful about that. Okay, I'm going to move on now to this will go a little bit quicker. Dealing with legalism, sin in the pursuit of the disciplines. Like, how do we, those are warning signs that we looked at. We looked at warnings that we need to be aware of and step in touch with. But here are some challenges. Legalism in someone else does not mean that thing they're legalistic about is wrong. Okay. What that means is it's very tempting to use the hypocrisy of others as an excuse for my laziness. Just because the Pharisee was being hypocritical does not mean that prayer is not a good thing. Does not mean that fasting was not a good thing. I think that hypocrisy in Christians is the biggest excuse the world uses for not seeking God. It's a very bad excuse. Just because I'm not perfect does not mean that the scriptures are not true and right, and not that they'll bring you to God. Even if someone else is very legalistic in their life, even if somebody else is very judgmental of my effort to find God, I need to make sure that I do not use that as an excuse to keep from pursuing these disciplines in my life. In other words, I have been accused a number of times of being very legalistic about my prayer life. I'll talk about that in a moment. But I need to make sure that when if I'm being fulfilled by my prayer life and the way that I do it, I should be very careful not to let somebody else accuse me and make me stop doing it out of embarrassment or fear. Challenge number 2. Legalism, if I find myself to be legalistic, that does not mean that what I'm being legalistic about is wrong. Okay? Sometimes when I go out praying, I don't want to be there. Sometimes it's hard to be there. Sometimes it's very cold. I can buy for the price of filling 1 tank of gasoline, I can buy enough warm clothing to keep me warm in almost any weather. I have a raincoat so that when it's raining, I can go out while it's raining. And there are many. Someone. Okay. Okay. So sometimes it's tempting when I see myself and I say, boy, you're really being legalistic right here. It's much easier to solve the problem by stopping the activity than fixing the legalism. That is the easiest solution. And I think it's a very cheap trick by Satan to put that on us. And it's a very tempting to just stop. I go out and I pray every morning and I'm just legalistic. So the answer is to stop praying every morning because it's just legalistic for me. We can't abandon the things that we know are right. We need to change the fact that we're being legalistic. We need to find a way to do what we're doing without being legalistic so that it's full of joy and it brings us peace and it draws us closer to God. In 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 7, it says, the Spirit God gave us does not make us timid, but gives us power, love, and self-discipline. The Spirit of God is not going to cause you to back away from pursuing God. That's of Satan. The Spirit gives you the power, the love, and the self-discipline to move forward with your disciplines before God. Challenge number 3. Getting close here. Doing something regularly does not make it legalistic. Sometimes people ask me, you actually go out every morning and pray? And I go, well, most mornings, some days I miss, but yeah, I work hard at going out every day. And they go, that's pretty legalistic. Well, I challenge them with this. I eat lunch every day. I go for a walk every day. I brush my teeth every day. There are many things I do every day. And no one, if someone might be surprised that if I didn't brush my teeth every day. They don't call this legalistic. Why? Because we know that these things are good. I know that these things are good for me. So no one would ever say they're legalistic. So why is it that if I pray every day and I make a point of praying every day, or I try to meditate every day, I know these things are good for me also. I know that from experience. So why should I allow someone to tell me that that's legalistic? Can it become legalistic? Yes, it can. If you start doing this so that other people are impressed by you, to meet other people's expectations, or if you're finding yourself not able to bring this in line with the Holy Spirit. But I think it's important to see good habits should never be considered to be legalistic, and we should never allow other people to convince us otherwise. That's the third challenge. A fourth challenge. Not starting a good activity because you're afraid of being legalistic is foolish. You know, people, every year we joke about New Year's resolutions. I'm going to go on a diet. I'm going to go to the gym every day. I'm going to pray 3 times a day. I'm going to start fasting this year. And after you've been around for 60 years, like me, 65, I stopped making New Year's resolutions because I know I don't keep them. People say, what was your New Year's resolution? I don't make New Year's resolutions. And why not? Well, because honestly, I don't keep them. And what's the point in starting? Well, if we're going to change, as I said at the top there, if I'm going to change, I have to change something in order to change, right? Nothing's going to change unless I do something different. And the fear of failure without even trying is a real challenge. The fear of failing, the fear that if I went out for an hour or for 45 minutes, if I dedicated 45 minutes to prayer, that I couldn't do that. I couldn't learn to do that. It would never work for me. I don't have enough to pray about. And we just don't start because we're afraid that we're going to fail. If we see this in our children, we are very concerned and we tell them, no, you have to try this, right? I'm not going to learn algebra. I can't learn algebra. Well, you have to learn algebra. You have to learn biology. The failure without even trying. We need to rise to this challenge. Maybe I'm afraid of becoming like somebody else who I think is legalistic. This is a very sinister, this is a very dangerous attitude. The parable of the bags of gold, as it says in the New English translation, or the talents. One man had 10 bags of gold and he went and invested them and got 10 more. The next man had 5 bags of gold. He went and invested them, got 5 more. And the third man was given a bag of gold and he was afraid of his master. And he was afraid he was going to fail, so he buried it in the ground. This is not a godly solution. That parable makes it very clear this is not what the master wants. And we need to be careful when we're doing the disciplines that we do not, we need to be challenged by the idea that we cannot back off from doing what is good because we're afraid of failing. Okay. Just in closing here, when we get serious about finding God, and I like to think of myself, I don't have quiet times. I have times when I go and find God. Because quiet, the name quiet time just sort of means, okay, I'm quiet for a little while, maybe I read my Bible, maybe I pray. But if I say this time I'm going to find God, it puts me in an attitude of actually going and finding God and connecting with him and talking with him and listening to his word and meditating on his precepts and his challenge and his laws and his scriptures. And we all are going to, if we do this, we are going to face legalism. We are going to face pride. We are going to face failure at times, and we're going to face our own selfishness. And these things, we have to decide that we're not going to let these things stop us. We need to be careful that we aren't prideful. We need to be careful that we don't become legalistic or selfish focused. We need to pay attention to the warnings, but don't be afraid of them. Just be aware of them. If I became afraid of the rumble strip on the highway, and I became so afraid of hitting the rumble strip that I never got on the highway, that would be foolishness, right? I'd never get anywhere. I have to go on the highway, but I have to pay attention to the rumble strips. We have to rise to meet the challenges. We can't be afraid of these challenges. And getting started sooner than later is important, and we cannot give up. We have to keep moving forward. And so I just really like to encourage the Geneva Church, as you're looking at these disciplines, to really grapple with these things I've shared with you tonight as a way of putting a bracket around what you're doing, and to be aware, and to help it, have these things help you move forward in your pursuit of knowing God. Thank you.